Welcome to Emotional Resilience, Living with the Fruit of the Spirit. I'm your host, Ron Ovitt, author of this Emotional Resilience series. Today we are in Session 6, The Brain, Part 4. The brain's primary job is to keep us alive. It's amazing how it works. So much of its function is automatic, going on without our conscious awareness. Our breathing, heart rate, vital organs, and sensory awareness processes are a 24/7 operation. The brain also predicts and assesses danger. This is where we can get into trouble with false predictions. But even here, our brain will help us discern truth if we let it. Let's look at this marvelous strategic command center that functions in our brain. There are many parts to the brain, and we'll talk about them from time to time, but for the most part, we'll focus on 6 key parts, and even out of that, only 4. The first is the thalamus, the sensory radar. What you need to know about this is that it's the sensory relay station. It's the part of the brain that gathers all the sensory input from our environment. It then diagnoses the sensory information and relays it to the appropriate part of the brain, most often the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Those 2 parts you'll need to know. Let's talk about the amygdala. The amygdala I like to call the watchdog. In the field of neuroscience, the amygdala has been compared to a guard shack. This is the part of the brain that receives the danger signals from the thalamus and alerts the body to go into fight or flight. It does this by receiving the filter sensory information from the thalamus and assesses it for potential danger. This happens behind the scenes, subconsciously, in milliseconds, using sensory, enriched, implicit memories from the perceived past, dangerous situations that we think about as its filtering agent. This is effective when a car is barreling toward us. The amygdala knows that loud, unannounced noises invading our space, like screeching tires, is a potentially lethal threat. It sends out alarms and causes us to what? Move out of the way. And then it calms us down when it perceives that we are safe. We need this part of the brain. It hijacks the rest of the brain and body and commands attention and shouts, "Move! No time for discussion." However, we get into trouble when we live in what I call a continuous, unavoidable stress, when stress is legitimately perceived and anticipated, making it unavoidable, but a live threat is not actually present. It's consciously anticipated, but not there. It's like thinking that a tiger is going to attack you all day, instead of living only in the moment if a tiger does actually attack. Although the reaction to continuous stress is not quite as severe as the emergency event it anticipates, it's close, as in a panic attacks, right? It makes the brain's survival emergency system run continuously, as though there's a predator in the room, or there's going to be a pop quiz at any moment that will show how inadequate we really are. You know what that feels like. This can play out in various ways, such as sitting in a stoplight, right, with one foot on the brake and the other on the gas, or you're acting like you're being followed. This then creates this hypervigilance, a constant low engine rev. Continuous unavoidable stress stems from the personal childhood beliefs and perceived consequences that we talked about in earlier sessions. In a state of continuous stress, the amygdala does its job by keeping us ready to move. Unfortunately, we remain in this hyper-vigilant state of arousal. I know I did for years. Why is this important? Because it's this arousal that causes emotional pain and the driving sense that must be dealt with. This is not like the sharp pain of a razor cut, although the same part of the brain registers it. This is more like the psychic pain that comes with chronic anxiety or obsessional thinking. It simply cannot be ignored. So we escape through overindulgence in excitement or substance, compulsive behavior, avoidance, people, emotionalism, and sex to rid ourselves of this pressure. We call these escapes. And they try to satisfy our emotional needs. We need to medicate and do these things to regulate our emotions. Now, once escape-seeking behavior is initiated, it becomes an impulse. Significant stress is put onto the amygdala. This is the moving from an impulse without care of the consequences to ourself or others to a compulsion, which seeks then to preserve us in the face of bad choices that we made and the negative consequences. And this causes the amygdala to add more motivation to escape. And so it just goes downhill. Now it becomes a craving. This moves us into compulsive craving mode. The amygdala is an important part, and we'll talk more about it. Let's look at the prefrontal cortex, the executive center. The prefrontal cortex is where attachments are made, storing assumptions and making predictions also. The executive center performs analysis and sends a calming, it's okay signal to the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala. It uses insight, logic, and judgment and applies it to circumstances or events and creates interpretations, perspectives, and makes decisions. It can also bring memories to mind and use new insight, logic, and judgment to adjust previous interpretations, resulting in new decisions. That's the key to emotional relearning that we'll be learning later. Another part is the striatum with the nucleus accumbens. I call this the craving center. When we're hungry, the brain sends a signal to the nucleus accumbens, releasing dopamine to get us going emotionally, specifically the striatum. As the dopamine levels rise, we feel an urgency to meet this need. I have to have it. As we eat, then serotonin is released and we feel satisfied. I have it. We're no longer hungry and we go back to the business at hand. Continuing with the same illustration of hunger, when the brain is in an escape-induced environment, we have an unbridled situation. The nucleus accumbens, the striatum, is susceptible to conditioning thanks to the prefrontal cortex, which emotionally learns that escapes work. It takes what excited us in the past and primes itself with dopamine to make it ready for when the trigger happens again. And as a result, when you use escapes, the nucleus accumbens, specifically the part called the striatum, become conditioned to want more, which means it's primed with dopamine. As your habit of choice continues to add dopamine to the nucleus accumbens, I gotta have it, turns into a full-blown craving addiction. When this highly agitated dopamine state exists in continuous unavoidable stress, we have the perfect storm. The nucleus accumbens recognizes what excited us in the past and primes itself with dopamine to be ready for the next trigger. Priming the brain with dopamine results in a highly agitated dopamine state which creates cravings. Continuous unavoidable stress automatically lowers serotonin. It turns off the satisfaction that serotonin gives and creates then a continuous craving zone. But there is some good news here. Studies have linked the nucleus accumbens and its communication with the hippocampus, that's a region associated with memory and emotion that plays a role in future planning, and it also with other parts of the brain, it relays it to what? Delaying of gratification. This means that we can use this part of the brain for its intended use of helping us resist impulses. We do this by remembering when we delayed in the past, how good it was for us, and we project a good future from waiting. We're essentially telling the nucleus accumbens, no, not now. We can also use our spiritual connection with God to help shape new hope. We can delay gratification for something better. This is how we ride that wave and dampen our triggers. We'll talk more about this in emotional regulation. The cingulate cortex is the next part. I call this the synchronization center. The ability to synchronize with other people happens in the cingulate cortex. As our right brain synchronizes with other people's right brains, we can conclude whether or not people are happy to be with us, and that feeds us. That helps us emotionally. The cingulate cortex sends signals then to the prefrontal cortex, which will predict outcomes. If the synchronization results in poor predictions, it can send a negative message back to the watchdog, the guard shack, the amygdala, for the fight or flight response. If it's positive, it will help us regulate our emotions and return to joy and peace. The return to peace and joy is aided through the regulation of serotonin. That's the natural chemical that the brain uses to calm us. If we did not learn resilience or emotional regulation, that's returning to peace and joy from painful emotions from our caregivers, then we will find that our brain does not regulate serotonin properly, and we will move toward doing it through other means. We will try to find comfort in negative ways, which we've called escapes. Another part is the hippocampus, and this is an important one. It's the memory center. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that manages our memory function. It's responsible for reassembling daily explicit, that's consciously aware of, memories, and plays a role in future planning. In trauma, or under continuous stress, cortisol is pumped through the body along with adrenaline, and that cortisol shuts off the part of the memory. In trauma or under continuous stress, that cortisol is pumped throughout the body, and so it shuts off the hippocampus. And so our amygdala starts looking at the sensations. It becomes the memory, but it's all implicit behind the scene. The brain parts work, but when there is emotional dysregulation, Rod?
The brain parts work. Let's do it right there.
You know, 10 is faster. It was on 9 before.
No.
But I feel more alive. Is it sounding okay?
Yeah, it sounds real good. So.
Right there.
Okay, ready?
Yes. The brain part works, but when there is emotional dysregulation.
Yeah, we'll take it as
What? It came, become, what? Okay, back it up.
Yeah. The brain part work.
No, hold on, I gotta reread this. Hang on. The brain parts work, but when there's emotional dysregulation, it came, become, dysregulate. What? Oh, the brain becomes. How did I get came?
Well, it's all right.
Dysregulated itself. Okay, that's how I'll do it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, ready?
Yes.
Take 3. This should be it. This connects from before.
All right.
Ready?
The brain parts work, but when there is emotional dysregulation, the brain becomes dysregulated itself. Emotional dysregulation is the inability of a person to control or regulate their emotional responses to challenging situations. The emotion is disproportionate to the circumstance, usually in the form of crying, panic, anger, withdrawal, accusations, passive-aggressive behaviors, chaos, arguing, or even aggression. Some of the signs of emotional dysregulation are emotional.
Some of the signs, yeah. Some of the signs. Okay, we'll go back.
I got tongue twisters here.
Yeah, some of the signs.
Mm-hmm.
Ready?
Yep.
You know what you're going to say? Okay. Some of the signs.
Mm-hmm. Some of the signs of emotional dysregulation are emotions that are too intense for the situation. A person is not able to calm themselves. There can be impulsive behavior or avoidant behavior. There's difficulty in recognizing one's own emotions. Perhaps we're being aggressive, or a strong focus on negative situations and thoughts, or there's poor attention spans. Emotional dysregulation can result in the brain dysregulation, which can then cause more emotional dysregulation. Let's consider a few ways that emotional dysregulation can result in brain dysregulation, resulting in more emotional dysregulation. Well, first of all, Dr. Alan Shore, tremendous scientist, has done seminal work in the area of childhood attachment. And we'll talk about attachment in a few sessions ahead, and the dysregulation of the right brain. According to Shore, data suggests that traumatic attachments resulting in emotional dysregulation are imprinted on the developing limbic and autonomic nervous systems of the early maturing right brain. These enduring structural changes lead to the inefficient stress coping mechanisms that lie at the core of the infant, child, and adult inability to cope with relational stress. Number 2, the interpretation of past trauma memory is that of a danger, and therefore the amygdala is hypersensitive to sensations related to that particular memory. As this is repeated, the brain becomes oversensitive and dysregulation sets in, especially if it's based on lies. The third way is when we overindulge in social media. Now this is one that's interesting for today, and our brains are bombarded with stimulation and it affects the brain. Now I'm adding this because it's so relevant to today's world. Dr. Linda Graham writes this: screen time affects our brains and bodies at multiple levels, manifesting in various mental health symptoms related to mood, anxiety, cognition, and behavior. Electronic screen syndrome, ESS, is essentially a disorder of dysregulation. Because it's so stimulating, interactive screen time shifts the nervous system into fight or flight mode, which leads to dysregulation and disorganization of various biological systems. Sometimes this stress response is immediate and obvious, such as while playing a video game. At other times, the stress response is more subtle, taking place gradually from repetitive screen interaction, such as frequent texting or social media use. Or it may be delayed, brewing under the surface, but managed well enough, then erupting once years of screen time have accumulated. Regardless, over time, repeated fight or flight and overstimulation of the nervous system from electronics will often eventually culminate in a dysregulated child. One way to think about the syndrome is to view electronics as a stimulant, in essence, not unlike caffeine or amphetamines or cocaine. Electronic screen device use puts the body into a state of high arousal and hyperfocus, followed by a crash. This overstimulation of the nervous system is capable of causing a variety of chemical, hormonal, and sleep disturbances in the same way other stimulants can. And just as a drug use can affect a user long after all traces of the drug are out of the body, electronic media use can affect the central nervous system long after the offending device is actually used. They're actually calling today this a form of addictions. We got to watch the way we use our media. The fourth thing is stress, whether it's emotional or physical. Stress, and we've talked about this, is a major player in the brain and emotional dysregulation. Stress through life circumstances, negative beliefs, lies that we believe about ourselves, poor diet and health, all these take effect on our brain. And then fifth, lack of cognitive flexibility. This is where the brain is stuck in either an under-aroused state, as in depression or low energy, or an over-aroused state, such as being hyperactive or anxious, or an unstable state where we are unable to successfully make transitions from one state to another. In many cases, it's a lack of communication between the emotional part of the brain, the limbic, and the prefrontal cortex. And then 6, emotional cognitive bias and avoidance. When our emotional center believes something, it can create a bias that can extinguish the communication to the prefrontal cortex. And we'll talk more about this as time goes on. We lose that communication between the limbic system, our amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex because of this overuse. And so that's important. And we can gain it back. That's the good news. All of this can be changed because of the plasticity of the brain. And that's the good news. Well, next time we're going to be looking at emotional dysregulation and how the autonomic nervous system works. So I look forward to seeing you in the next session.